God has lots of ways of making and keeping his people humble, which we have to acknowledge is a good thing. It's good for us to be humble. Every now and again we might pray for it, pray for humility. That's a very dangerous prayer to pray, of course. I think there are three main ways, at least in my experience. Certainly God can do whatever he wants, but there are three main ways that God makes and keeps his people humble. The first I think we're pretty familiar with, particularly as Reformed Christians, those of us that are. We talk about sin a lot. God uses our sin to reveal to us our relative smallness, our failures, our disobediences, our fallenness. God uses our sin to keep us humble. God also uses our circumstances, doesn't he, to keep us humble. That's part of what I think is happening in this global pandemic. God is humbling his church, maybe freeing us from some of the sins that we've been enjoying and idols that we've been bowing down to. But just the simple reality of we're living in new circumstances, and we've got to figure out what that looks like. How do we trust God? How do we depend upon him? How do I live with the reality that I'm not in control as I thought I was? What used to be familiar and easy is now challenging and difficult, having to relearn things. Our circumstances God uses to keep us humble. But I think the most profound and probably the longest lasting change comes to us not from being humbled by our circumstances or by our sin, but by God's sovereignty. I picked the word sovereignty because it fits nicely with sin and circumstances, so you're welcome for that. But I use it as an umbrella term to refer to God's bigness. If our being humbled is helping us maintain a sense of our smallness, the main means by which we need to get there is by a sense of God's bigness, his holiness, his righteousness, his power, his control over all things. That is what is ultimately going to, and most lastingly going to, humble us. When we see God for who he is, it's only then that we're really able to see ourselves for who we are. I've been recently reading Job and have spent the last several days in just the last few chapters of that book. You may be familiar with the story of Job, a righteous man, not a notorious sinner. In fact, the scriptures tell us that in all the things that happened to him, Job never sinned against God with his mouth. But his friends thought that his circumstances were the result of his sin and that he needed to repent. His circumstances were he lost all 10 of his children in one day. He lost all of his property, his flocks and his herds, all stolen or destroyed. His friends mocked him and made fun of him. His body started falling apart. His wife pretty much gave up on him and disowned God and told him to do the same. And his best friends sat with him for about a week and kind of listened to him and endured him and abided with him. But after a week, they couldn't handle it anymore, and they turned on him, basically. They tried to rebuke him. Their vision of God was insufficient and inaccurate, and they were confident that Job's sufferings, his circumstances, were the result of his sin, and they called him to repent. It's the only way it could have worked in their economy, the way they understood things. But what ultimately humbles Job at the end of the book is not God showing up and saying, Job, here's the list of your 14 sins that have caused the circumstances. God doesn't do that. It's not God showing up and explaining the circumstances. God doesn't say, as we the reader know, God doesn't show up to Job and say, Job, the evil one has done this to you. I allowed him to do it, but I had purposes that were beyond you. Job doesn't hear that from the Lord. What Job gets from God is not the view behind the curtain. What God gives Job is, where were you when I created the stars? Do you know where the snow is stored? Do you know where the hail is kept? Are you the one that calls out the lightning and the thunder? Are you aware of where those things come from? You want to hear from me? I'll tell you something about me. I am eternal. I am all powerful. I am glorious. I know all things and I can do all things. And it is that vision of God's bigness, God's sovereignty, that is what humbles Job. It is on that account that Job says, I am of small account, when Job puts his hand over his mouth and says, I've heard about you, but now I've seen you, and I have nothing to say. It is the vision of a big God that is what humbles Job. And that's what we need. We need to be humbled because of our sin. We are sinners. We need to be humbled through our circumstances. We live thinking that we can control things and that we are top dog. The reality is we're not. But what's ultimately going to humble us is a vision and a view of a great and glorious God. And so in the midst of these days, and hopefully all days, yes, let's look to our sin and repent where we need to repent. Let's look to our circumstances and understand the times and what it is God is trying to teach us. But in all of that, you can do all of that and miss God. So let us in these days not miss the God who is. The word in Job 42, verse 6, repent in dust and ashes, can also be translated, am comforted in dust and ashes. It's one of the great paradoxes, isn't it, of the Christian life, that when we are appropriately humbled, we actually there, by that same God who has humbled us, there we are comforted. We find our rest. We find our home. Because no longer are we too big for our britches. We're where we should be. We're the right size, of small account, in comparison to the great and glorious God who loves us and has given himself for us.